You know, when you go to the grocery store, you usually check your receipt before you leave the parking lot.
Right, just to make sure.
Yeah, exactly. You glance at it just to make sure you didn't get double charged for, I don't know, a carton of eggs or to verify if those apples were actually on sale. It's a finite document. It has a top, it has a bottom, and you can understand the real world value of every single item printed on that paper.
Well, yeah, it's a comforting ritual. It adheres to basic math. You traded a specific amount of money for a specific thing in your bag. There's really no mystery to a gallon of milk.
Right. But I want you to imagine a scenario where you look at that receipt, and instead of ending after 20 items, it just keeps unspooling.
Oh, wow.
It rolls out the door, down the street, across the whole city. And as you try to read it, half the items are written in these complex acronyms you don't even understand.
And the prices are probably absurd.
Completely absurd. They're so high they stop looking like human currency and start looking like coordinates to another solar system. You're suddenly looking at this absolute abyss of spending.
I mean, that is probably the most accurate visualization I've heard for stepping into the modern military budget of the United States. It completely defies our everyday understanding of how money and debt actually work.
Yeah. So if you've ever looked at your tax bill and wondered where all that money eventually flows, today we have a massive deep dive just for you. We're looking at a system that currently spends roughly $4 billion a day.
It's staggering.
Let me just say that again so it settles. $4 billion every single day of the year. And yet somehow the prevailing sentiment is that it's never quite enough.
Well, when you break down that daily rate, $4 billion every 24 hours means they're spending roughly $166 million every single hour.
Wow.
Yeah, they're spending millions of dollars literally in the time it takes us to just introduce this topic.
That's insane. So to help us navigate this, we have a really fascinating stack of sources today. We're pulling from an investigative video transcript called the Invisible Hand Report. We're pairing that with this dense 144-page Pentagon budget brief.
Which is quite a read.
Oh, yeah, it's a lot. And we also have some recent analysis on military procurement and a really sobering look into the global supply chains for critical minerals.
And that's where the conversation takes a very unexpected turn. I mean, it moves from spreadsheets to raw geology.
It really does. Now, the mission of this deep dive is very specific. We're going to intentionally look past all the political talking points.
Right, putting the cable news stuff aside.
Exactly. We're setting that aside to examine the raw data. We want to map out the black hole of the $900 billion U.S. defense budget. We're going to explain the structural reasons why things cost so much and look at this quiet, massive shift in American military strategy that almost nobody is talking about.
And we're going to focus on the why and the how. We aren't just going to throw billions and trillions at you. We want to unpack the actual mechanics that make those numbers a reality.
Yeah, and a quick formatting check. We're going to keep the words modern. This world is choked with dense government jargon, and we promise to actively avoid it. If we hit an acronym, we'll define it right away.
Right, so no prerequisite reading required.
Okay, let's unpack this. A $900 billion budget. Our brains just didn't evolve to visualize that much money, you know?
Yeah, not at all.
Like, we can visualize $1,000, maybe $1 million, as a giant pile of briefcases, but $900 billion, it's just abstract math. So let's ground it. Let's look at the first week of the 2026 conflict with Iran.
That's a perfect lens to start with. It really shows the sheer velocity of the expenditures. When you look at just the first 7 days of that conflict, the total cost bill to the American taxpayer was $11 billion.
$11 billion vanished in a week.
Yeah. And let's zoom in even further. Let's audit the receipts for just day one. On the very first day, the U.S. launched 200 Tomahawk cruise missiles.
Okay.
Each one cost $1.7 million.
Yeah.
So that's $340 million incinerated right there.
Wait, let me pause on that because we hear missile and we just think of like a metal tube with fire coming out the back. But a Tomahawk is basically a flying robot, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's highly sophisticated. It uses advanced GPS, terrain matching radar, a turbofan engine. You're firing a vehicle that's more complex than most commercial airplanes, and you're intentionally crashing it into a concrete bunker.
And we launched 200 of them. Boom. $340 million.
Right.
Then, moving down the receipt, you have the fighter jet sorties. And our sources define a sorties as just a single flight mission by one aircraft. So the receipt for those sorties for day one was $271 million. And I have to admit, that number genuinely throws me. Over $250 million just to fly the planes? I mean, jet fuel is expensive, but it's not that expensive, right?
Right.
Are they replacing the engines after every flight?
I get the confusion, but you have to look at the whole logistical tale. You aren't just paying for fuel, you're paying for the extreme wear and tear on these highly sensitive components.
Oh, right.
You're paying for massive maintenance crews working around the clock, the aerial refueling tankers that have to meet them midair, combat hazard pay. The ecosystem to keep advanced jets airborne in hostile airspace is just incredibly vast.
So it's the invisible support structure beneath the wings.
Okay.
Then you have the naval presence, two massive carrier strike groups in the region. And our sources note that even if they aren't actively launching planes, just having two floating cities sitting in the water costs roughly $15 million a day.
Just to maintain their position. The payroll for thousands of sailors, the nuclear reactors, the food, the desalination plants for fresh water. It's a constant burn rate.
And finally, rounding out day one, you have the B-2 stealth bombers. Now, these don't just fly out of a base next door. They fly nonstop from their home base in Missouri all the way across the Atlantic, drop their payload, and fly all the way back.
It's a massive journey.
That single day of B-2 flights cost another $30 million.
So when you aggregate all of that, the Tomahawks, the sorties, the carriers, the bombers, that massive day of full-scale war cost $1.9 billion.
$1.9 billion for a single 24-hour period.
And here is the truly fascinating part. That $1.9 billion, it represents roughly 0.2% of the annual U.S. defense budget.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm hearing that decimal point correctly. 0.2%.
Less than a quarter of 1%, yes.
So, if dropping 200 cruise missiles and flying stealth bombers across the globe is a literal rounding error, where on Earth is the other 99.8% of the money actually going?
That is the definitive question. And it's the mystery we're going to unravel by looking at the day-to-day reality of the Pentagon.
Yeah, to understand that 99.8%, we have to look at how the military treats its budget when it thinks nobody is looking. Let's look at some notable cases. In March 2026, a watchdog group called Open the Books released a report on government spending from the previous September. And it was shocking. In just 5 days, the government spent $50 billion.
The timing there is key. September isn't just a random month. It's the final month of the federal fiscal year.
Ah, the classic use it or lose it shopping spree. I've seen this in corporate life, but the scale here is terrifying. If an agency doesn't spend its whole budget, Congress will say, well, you didn't need it, so we're cutting your budget next year.
Exactly. It completely flips frugality upside down. It creates this frantic panic to empty the accounts. Frugality is punished, and reckless spending is rewarded.
And they definitely emptied them. Buried in that $50 billion were some bizarre purchase orders. The records show that in 1 month, the Pentagon spent $2 million on Alaskan king crab,
Yeah.
$15 million on ribeye steak,
Oh.
and over $7.4 million on lobster tails.
It's wild.
And it wasn't just one big party. They bought bulk lobster on 4 separate occasions in a single month.
Do they have a strategic seafood reserve or something?
I mean, the visual is undeniably terrible. It paints a picture of generals cracking crab legs while reviewing troop movements. It feels like a dark comedy.
$7.4 million on lobster tails? That's a whole elementary school's budget. It's absurd.
It is absurd, and taxpayers get incredibly angry. But, and this is a crucial pivot, we have to ground this in the mathematical scale we're discussing.
$15 million on steak is a lot to us, but in a $900 billion budget, it's statistical noise. It's a symptom of a broken culture, sure, but to find the real money, you have to look past the cafeteria. You have to look at the hardware.
Okay, let's leave the lobster and look at the hardware. And there's no glaring example quite like the F-35 Lightning fighter jet program. This was supposed to be the undisputed cornerstone of the Air Force.
The F-35 is a masterclass in how procurement, which is just the process of the government buying things from private companies, can spiral utterly out of control. Let's look at the timeline. The initial contract was awarded back in 2001. The projected cost for the whole program was estimated at $200 billion.
Which even then is monumental.
Right. But fast forward to today, the projected lifetime cost has ballooned to over $2 trillion.
$2 trillion with a T.
Yes, a tenfold increase. To put that in perspective, that's like fully funding the entire NASA space program for 80 consecutive years, all absorbed by one type of jet.
I am genuinely struggling to comprehend how that happens. How do you miss the mark by $1.8 trillion? If a mechanic quotes me 200 bucks and bills me 2,000, I'm calling the cops.
It happens when a system loses its grip on the concept of financial limits. One of the most chilling details in our sources is a direct quote from an internal Pentagon report. The auditors bluntly stated, quote, affordability is no longer embraced as a core pillar of the program.
Wow, let that marinate. Affordability is no longer a core pillar. Imagine a family looking at their mortgage and saying, you know what? Affordability isn't a core pillar of this household. Let's buy a yacht.
It's complete detachment from economic gravity. And you see this everywhere, not just with stealth jets. Take the Stinger missile. In 1991, a single Stinger cost about $25,000. Today, that exact same missile costs $500,000.
20 times more expensive for the exact same capability.
Exactly. And the contrast here is vital. While we spend $500,000 to fire one defensive missile, look at our adversaries. In the Middle East, Iranian proxies have paralyzed shipping lanes using swarms of basic explosive drones. Do you know what those drones cost?
Given the Stinger's price, this is going to hurt. What is it?
As little as $500 each.
So we're firing a $500,000 missile to shoot down a $500 piece of plastic.
It's an unsustainable economic asymmetry. The lesson is profound. An adversary doesn't need to defeat the U.S. military in combat if they can just bankrupt the Treasury by making us defend ourselves against cheap swarms.
To really simplify why this happens, why a jet goes to $2 trillion, we need an analogy. I think the best way to understand it is to think about hiring a contractor for a home renovation.
Walk me through it.
Normally you get a quote. The contractor says, I'll redo your kitchen for $50,000. If they run into mold and it costs them $60,000, they eat that $10,000 loss.
That's how a normal market functions. The risk is on the seller.
Right. But the military uses something called a cost-pluses contract. Going back to the renovation, it means you don't agree on a final price. You sign a paper agreeing to pay for every piece of material, every hour of labor, plus a guaranteed 10% profit on top of whatever the final bill is.
Which fundamentally changes the incentives.
It flips them upside down. Suddenly, your contractor has zero incentive to buy the cheap $3 tiles. Why not buy the $30 Italian marble? The more expensive the materials, the bigger the overall bill. And since their profit is a percentage of that total bill, the more wildly expensive the renovation becomes, the bigger their profit check.
It's a brilliantly insidious mechanism. Efficiency is penalized, bloat is rewarded.
So these wild examples aren't accidents. They're the mathematical result of the system. Let's transition into the current practices. Where does that hidden 99.8% of the budget actually live day to day?
The first massive chunk goes to something incredibly mundane. Just keeping the lights on.
The baseline operational costs.
Right. Before they buy a single new jet, the military spends $352 billion simply maintaining existing operations. That's larger than the entire GDP of Portugal.
People forget the Pentagon is the ultimate global landlord, employer, and logistics company.
Precisely. Nearly $200 billion goes purely toward the workforce. Pensions, massive housing allowances, a global healthcare system, and heavily subsidized grocery stores on bases.
It's essentially a self-contained welfare state inside the broader country. And then there are the legacy costs, cleaning up unexploded bombs, managing toxic chemical spills.
And extending outward, you have the physical footprint. The U.S. maintains roughly 750 military bases outside its own borders.
750 foreign bases.
Spread across 80 countries. Keeping that network open costs nearly $100 billion a year. That's more than the U.K. spends on its entire national defense budget.
That's a staggering comparison. And one source highlighted Diego Garcia, this tiny atoll in the Indian Ocean. It has 2,000 personnel, a bowling alley, fast food franchises. They ship over frozen American pizzas just to maintain morale thousands of miles away.
Think about the logistical friction of shipping bowling shoes to the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's exactly why America First arguments resonate. People see this massive drain of resources outward while domestic infrastructure crumbles.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as big as the payroll is, the real complexities happen when the military goes shopping. The procurement monopoly. If they're trapped in cost-plus contracts, why not just go to a different store?
Well, out of the budget, about $450–500 billion goes to private contractors. But it's no longer a free market.
Back in the 90s, there were 51 major defense contractors competing. Competition kept prices somewhat grounded. Today, we're down to just 5.
5 massive conglomerates: Lockheed Martin, RTX, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman.
5 companies capturing a third of a $500 billion budget.
And it creates a severe economic distortion. Normally, a monopoly is one company selling to millions of people, like a water company. You have to buy from them.
They dictate the terms.
But in defense, the dynamic is inverted. You have one buyer, the government, and essentially one seller capable of building a high-tech system. If the military needs an F-35, there is exactly one corporate entity on Earth that manufactures it: Lockheed Martin.
The Pentagon can't just log on to Amazon and look for a cheaper stealth fighter.
No, they are a captive audience. The buyer is forced to pay whatever astronomical price the seller demands.
Which leads to the geographic job trap. You might be listening and thinking, okay, if the jet is 10 times over budget, why doesn't Congress just cancel it?
And the answer is a masterclass in political engineering by the defense industry.
Unpack how they do that. When Lockheed gets a contract, they don't just build one efficient factory in one town. From an engineering standpoint, that makes sense, but politically it's a liability. So they deliberately spread the manufacturing across as many congressional districts as possible.
The F-35 supply chain involves facilities in 45 different states.
45 out of 50 states. So imagine you're a newly elected representative, you know the jet is a scam, you want to cancel it, but the factory making the landing gear is right in your district, employing 2,000 voters. If you vote to cancel the jet, you fire your own constituents.
You're committing political suicide.
Precisely. They've weaponized the supply chain. Plus, contractors have spent over $2.5 billion on lobbying since 2001. The system simply cannot be cut by normal means.
The inefficiency of the system, the spread-out factories, isn't a bug. It's the actual glue holding the political coalition together.
So we have the metal jets spread across 45 states, but there's a whole other layer to this budget. If Lockheed has a monopoly on the metal, who has the monopoly on the code? Let's look at the shadow tech budget.
There's a massive shift away from heavy hardware and towards software. Specifically, AI Silicon Valley saw the fortunes legacy contractors were making and decided they wanted in.
But if you look at the Pentagon budget brief, you won't find a clean line item that just says AI.
No, they're very clever about it. They describe AI as a pervading capability baked into everything, which conveniently hides the total cost from auditors.
But analysts dug into the numbers, and since 2016, the Pentagon has quietly spent at least $75 billion on integrated AI programs.
And $13.4 billion of that is purely for autonomous systems, robotic submarines hunting independently, drone swarms that communicate and attack without human intervention.
They're also spending $800 million just to develop AI wingmen.
Which is revolutionary. It's an unmanned drone flying alongside a human pilot. The human acts like a quarterback, and the AI drone autonomously executes the high-risk maneuvers without risking a human life.
And we saw this in real-world application during the recent strikes on Iran.
Yes. The U.S. used Palantir, an advanced data analytics firm. And to understand the shift from hardware to software, Palantir is now worth 3 times as much as Lockheed Martin.
Let that sink in. The software company processing data is valued at 3 times more than the company building supersonic jets.
Because data is the new high ground. During the Iran conflict, Palantir, working with AI from Anthropic, ingested massive amounts of raw intelligence.
What does the AI actually do there?
Well, a human can't look at a live satellite feed, listen to radio chatter, analyze financial records simultaneously, but the AI can. It ingested all of that in real time, instantly identifying patterns a human never could, and generated precise target locations.
And the tactical result?
The military autonomously identified and struck over 1,000 targets within the first 24 hours. It represents a scale of warfare that was impossible 5 years ago.
Okay, so we have the metal jets, the AI software, but there's a third piece tying it all together, the mineral choke point.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we're entering an era of resource-constrained warfare. Critical minerals are the new oil.
Niobium, neodymium, elements most people haven't even heard of.
Rare earth elements. They are the non-negotiable building blocks of modern tech. You can't build a precision missile or an F-35 engine without them.
And this is where the U.S. has an existential vulnerability, a massive supply chain shock waiting to happen, because while we pour trillions into weapons, we don't control the raw ingredients.
The statistics are sobering. China controls between 85 and 90% of the entire global capacity for processing rare earth minerals. They hold a near absolute monopoly on refining the dirt into usable materials.
85 to 90%. That's a choke point.
And the domestic situation in the U.S. is bleak. There is exactly one active rare earth mine in the U.S., in California. And for niobium, which is essential for jet engines, there are 0 active mines in the U.S. Brazil controls 90% of that.
Why can't the U.S. just open more mines, just start digging in Nevada?
2 hurdles: environmental toxicity and capital cost. Separating these elements requires massive amounts of toxic acids and produces radioactive wastewater. For decades, the U.S. outsourced this dirty work to China because it was cheaper and cleaner for us. Building a domestic refinement chain today would take a decade of permitting and billions in capital.
So if China or Brazil decides to tighten export controls tomorrow, if they just keep the refined minerals for themselves, the American defense manufacturing base grinds to a halt.
Instantly. You can't build a smartphone, let alone a bomber, without them.
Yeah.
And the government is aware of this. In March 2026, the Defense Logistics Agency issued emergency requests to boost domestic supplies of 13 critical minerals. They are scrambling.
I have an analogy that ties these 3 elements together perfectly.
Let's hear it.
Think of the military arsenal like a smartphone. The traditional weapons, the tanks, the ships, the titanium jets built by Lockheed, that's the physical hardware. The glass screen, the metal case.
Right, the tangible shell.
The AI, the Palantir targeting systems, that's the operating system. The invisible software making the dumb hardware do complex things.
Brains.
But the critical minerals, that's the battery. And the brutal reality is you can spend $2 trillion building the best titanium phone case and $75 billion coding the most brilliant OS. But if you don't have a battery, all you have is a very expensive paperweight.
That perfectly encapsulates the crisis. You're utterly dependent on the battery. And the U.S. is waking up to the reality that its biggest geopolitical rival is manufacturing all the batteries.
This stark realization is causing a massive shift in what the military is preparing for. Which brings us to future implications.
If you look at the 10-year trend line in that budget brief, it tells a very clear story about how the military is transforming its arsenal.
I expected to see a spike in tanks given the land wars on the news, but the trend line shows something else.
It reveals what they're abandoning. Spending on traditional ground systems tanks, artillery is completely flat or actively declining.
They're abandoning the tank.
They aren't investing in ground forces. But look at the growth areas. Shipbuilding is up 141%. Long-range missiles up 157%. Command networks up 214%. And space combat is up a staggering 379%.
Ships, missiles, networks, space. It's painfully obvious who the U.S. thinks it will fight next. They aren't preparing for a land war in Europe. They're preparing for a vast naval and aerospace conflict in the Pacific. They're preparing for China.
The budget is the truest expression of strategy. But there's another darker trend buried here. A new nuclear arms race.
This barely made a blip in the news. In February 2026, the START Treaty quietly vanished.
The new START agreement between the U.S. and Russia expired. And due to geopolitical breakdowns, it wasn't renewed.
What does that mean practically?
For the first time since 1972, there are absolutely no legally binding limits on the number of nuclear weapons either side can deploy. The guardrails are gone.
No limits in over 50 years.
And the U.S. is using this window to completely overhaul its nuclear triad. The current silos, subs, and bombers were built in the 80s, so they're replacing all of it at once.
The logistics of that must be astronomical.
It's a generational project.
Yeah.
New Columbia-class submarines, B-21 stealth bombers, and the new Sentinel ICBMs.
And the Sentinel program involves physically ripping out and replacing 400 underground nuclear silos across 5 states, right?
Exactly. Digging up millions of tons of earth, pouring new concrete, just the upgrades to the delivery systems, not even counting the actual radioactive warheads, is currently priced at $60 billion.
$60 billion just for the vehicles to carry the bombs. So, to recap, the baseline is huge, F-35s are $2 trillion, the nuclear upgrade is massive. But recently, there was a proposal to push the ceiling even further, a proposed $1.5 trillion budget.
This was a major initiative proposed by President Trump. And to understand how a budget jumps to $1.5 trillion, you have to understand the legislative mechanism proposed, a reconciliation bill.
Let's define that. A reconciliation bill is a loophole designed for speed. Normally, a budget needs 60 votes to overcome a Senate filibuster. Reconciliation bypasses that. It only needs 51 votes and limits debate. It's explicitly designed to pass massive spending quickly with less scrutiny.
Which is exactly why it's used for the most ambitious, expensive proposals.
So, looking impartially at the text of the plan, the wish list for this extra $500 billion was broken into some sci-fi projects. The first was the Golden Dome.
The Golden Dome is essentially a vastly expanded national missile defense. The idea is to launch thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit, armed with interceptors or lasers. The goal is to create an impenetrable shield in space to destroy incoming hostile missiles.
It sounds like trying to build a roof over a stadium using falling ping pong balls. The physics seem mind-boggling.
The orbital mechanics are staggering. It's reminiscent of Reagan's Star Wars program in the 80s, which was eventually abandoned because the tech didn't exist.
What do physicists say about it today?
Physicists at MIT reviewed it and concluded it remains incredibly daunting. Defending against a full nuclear salvo would require hundreds of thousands of satellites in perfect sync. They stated that mathematically, it's basically impossible to guarantee a leak-proof shield. And a shield that's 99% effective is a failed shield in nuclear war.
And the cost estimates are wild. The Congressional Budget Office estimated it at $542 billion. But the American Enterprise Institute looked at the same proposal and estimated $3.6 trillion.
When expert estimates differ by over $3 trillion, it shows how unprecedented and unproven the project is.
Then there was the Golden Fleet.
This focused on naval dominance, building 20 to 25 massive brand-new Trump-class battleships, 30 to 40,000 tons each, the heaviest ships built since World War II.
I have to push back. We just talked about cheap drones changing warfare. Aren't 25 massive, slow-moving ships just floating targets for cheap missiles?
It's a massive debate. Proponents argue you need sheer mass for the heavy power generation required for rail guns and hypersonic missiles. But naval analysts note that American shipyards are so degraded, the first ship wouldn't even be ready until the mid-2030s at the earliest.
So it's highly speculative. And the final piece was expanding autonomous weapons.
Yes, dedicating $13.4 billion purely to drone swarms and robotic warfare. This actually aligns with the brutal lessons of modern battlefields, leaning into AI rather than heavy metal.
But proposing $1.5 trillion is one thing. Finding the money is another. And reporting objectively from our sources, the complex funding plan for this has essentially collapsed.
It fell apart upon contact with legal reality. The plan relied on two pillars of revenue. The first was massive global economic tariffs, projected to bring in $2.5 trillion over a decade.
But those hit a legal wall.
Precisely. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the executive branch didn't have the constitutional authority to impose those tariffs unilaterally. Without that, the projected revenue instantly vanished. The legally permissible tariffs would only cover about 15% of the hike.
The second pillar was the efficiency drive by the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE.
They initially promised to find $2 trillion in federal waste to pay for the military. But as the audit progressed, statutory law set in. The savings shrank from $2 trillion to $1 trillion, then plummeted.
How do you lose $1.9 trillion in savings?
Because what looks like waste is often legally mandated spending. You can't casually cut veterans' pensions or tear up a Lockheed contract without triggering massive termination fees.
So what was the final verified number DOGE actually found?
Independent analysts evaluated the legally actionable cuts and placed the realizable savings closer to $10 billion.
To $10 billion, from a promised $2 trillion. $10 billion isn't even enough for the hull of one battleship.
Exactly. So the unavoidable mathematical result is that the funding plan completely fell apart. To execute that $1.5 trillion budget today, it would rely entirely on raw deficit spending, adding it directly to the $39 trillion national debt.
Which raises a historically grounded question. This raises an important question. What happens to a nation when it borrows endlessly for the military while its domestic economy struggles with debt?
That is the most sobering dimension of this deep dive. Because while the weapons are new, the macroeconomic pattern of debt and defense is old.
Walk us through the historical parallel.
Let's look at the shifting economy. In 1960, the U.S. generated 40% of global GDP. Today, as other nations industrialized, the U.S. share has fallen to 24%.
The economic footprint shrunk relative to the rest of the world?
Yes, but the U.S. still accounts for roughly 40% of all global military spending. The core economy shrunk, but military expenditure remains at its absolute peak proportion.
And who else followed that exact trajectory?
The Soviet Union.
Unpack that timeline for us.
In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets were forced to back down. The Kremlin viewed it as a massive humiliation. The new leader, Brezhnev, vowed to achieve absolute military parity with the U.S., no matter the cost.
Whatever the price, they would pay it.
Exactly. In the 60s, they spent about 10% of GDP on the military. But driven by paranoia, that quietly doubled. By the 80s, the USSR was spending 20% of its entire economic output purely on the military.
It's 20%. You can't build roads or hospitals if 20% is going to missiles.
It was fatal. By funneling all their capital into tanks, they entirely neglected civilian infrastructure and consumer goods. They hollowed out their society to build an invincible shell, and we know how it ended. The economy gave out, the debt became unmanageable, and the USSR collapsed from within.
Our sources note economic historians see the same pattern in the fall of the Roman Empire and the decline of the British Empire.
When a great power loses economic dominance relative to competitors, there's a dangerous temptation. Massive military power becomes a psychological substitute for economic strength. Building a battleship feels like strength. It's an illusion of dominance using the last lever of control they have, even as the fiscal foundation crumbles.
Now, obviously, the U.S. in 2026 is not the Soviet Union in 1989.
No, it's important to state the differences. The U.S. economy is vastly larger and more dynamic. Crucially, the U.S. holds the world's reserve currency, granting a magical capacity to borrow that the USSR never had.
But the warning light is still blinking red. The danger is that the military budget becomes an unbreakable ecosystem that devours the host economy.
Military spending is a vital tool for deterrence. But when you're spending more than the next 10 nations combined, and the system is plagued by monopolies, cost-plus inefficiencies, and staggering mineral supply chain vulnerabilities, it evolves into a systemic risk to the entire country.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today, and before we wrap up, we want to leave you with a few knowledge gap questions to explore on your own.
The first question I'd urge you to look into. If the U.S. procurement system, reliant on 5 monopolies, is so wildly expensive, what does a truly efficient model look like? How do allied nations like France or South Korea build advanced weaponry without completely bankrupting their treasuries? What legislative models are working elsewhere?
That's a great avenue. And the second question, how exactly do rare earth minerals get processed? Trace the physical life cycle. Look up how a scoop of dirt from California or a niobium mine in Brazil actually gets chemically refined, transported, and turned into a heat-resistant magnet inside a missile. It exposes how precarious modern warfare really is.
It completely demystifies the sleek technology and grounds it in raw geography and chemistry.
So what does this all mean? If we zoom all the way out, the $900 billion budget isn't just a list of weapons. It's a self-sustaining corporate and political ecosystem. The military is rapidly pivoting towards space, AI, and the Pacific. But simultaneously, that futuristic vision is anchored down by 20th century monopolies, cost-plus incentives, and potentially fatal resource bottlenecks in rare earth minerals.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. History has proven across centuries that the nation with the most expensive military doesn't always win. As the nature of war shifts from brute explosive power toward AI algorithms and fragile rare earth supply chains, what exactly happens to a global superpower when it realizes its new $2 trillion fleet of stealth fighter jets might be entirely dependent on batteries and minerals chemically refined by its biggest rival?
That is a deeply chilling thought and the exact kind of stark reality check this massive budget desperately needs. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers that shape our world. We hope it gave you a new lens through which to view the news. Keep questioning the numbers behind the headlines, stay curious, and next time you look at a receipt at the grocery store, just be profoundly glad it actually comes to an end.